Welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to New Vegas, where today we're going to take on the rest of our thrown/placed explosives, because we only got 4 of them left to talk about, so let's go over each of these. They don't really fit together thematically, but yeah, some of them do. The first one is kind of the one that doesn't. So our very first explosive that we're going to be talking about is the flashbang. The flashbang can be found in the Lonesome Road. This one can be found in various containers there, and it is more useful in the Lonesome Road than it is outside of the Lonesome Road. So for the stats of the flashbang, this one requires 50 explosives and 4 strength in order to wield. So fairly high strength and pretty high explosives for a thrown explosive. So this one does 1 damage on direct hit and then 0 damage from the explosion. This isn't entirely accurate because it still will do some damage thanks to like the limb damage that it can do. So this can still kill enemies. It's not going to kill them super quickly though. This one also has 1 DPS because it has 1 damage on it, so if you hit something with it, that's your 1 damage right there. This one does actually have a pretty big explosion radius, bigger than what it actually shows, even more so if you have like splash damage on this, like I did with my character, so you can hit multiple enemies with this. This has a big old 0 for crit damage. Like, actually all the weapons we're going to talk about have no crit damage on them. This has a 1x crit modifier, doesn't matter if you can't really hit crits. This one costs 24 action points to be using in VATS, same as normal thrown explosives. This one weighs half a weight, just like most of the thrown explosives. And this one does have the unique effect of adding either fatigue or frenzy chance to enemies. Frenzy chance will only work on the tunnelers in the Lonesome Road, which can be useful if you frenzy a tunneler. They can potentially attack other tunnelers, so that's going to be like the main use that flashbangs actually have. The fatigue damage is similar to fatigue from like the boxing gloves, the boxing tape, or the 12 gauge beanbags, where you try to knock down enemies with them. If you knock down an enemy, that does make it easier to fight later, or you can just leave it there if you're doing a pacifist run. Flashbangs might actually be pretty decent on a pacifist run if you want something like that. It will probably take multiple flashbangs in order to hit enemies, as well as when I was trying to get footage for this, it's actually very laggy if you hit multiple enemies. This is very similar to fire, like the incendiary grenades, and I think the fire bombs had the same problem when I was trying to record them. It's difficult to get footage if you're hitting multiple enemies with a flashbang because they are usually kind of clumped up then. Let's go over the pros and cons of all these weapons. The flashbang will be kind of excluded from the pros and cons because the main pro to the flashbang is that it's non-lethal. The main con to the flashbang is that it's non-lethal. So if you are going with a pacifist run, this could be good. If you're not going with that, I wouldn't really recommend taking the flashbangs unless you're just going to use them against the tunnelers, in which case then they can be decent enough. Although I think the flare gun is kind of better in that sort of situation, similar to how it is against the Deathclaws. So for the pros of the rest of these weapons, they do have high damage, because we're going to be talking about the Nuka Grenade, the Satchel Charge, and the Fat Mine here in a second, and all of them do lots of damage. They are all craftable too, which is pretty awesome. The flashbangs you can't craft, you just have to find them, and they all have really good AoE. The flashbang actually does have a good AoE, so I guess that would also be a pro towards it. Cons to these weapons, though, are the weight. Weight can matter with weapons like this, because you're going to have to carry around multiple of them, and particularly with the Fat Mine, it is quite heavy, so that can be rough. Self-damage is also always an issue with these, except for the flashbang where you can't really hurt yourself. You can blind yourself with them, but you can't really hurt yourself with them, so there's that. There are also quite a few perks that help out with these too. Pack Rat can be really useful for cutting the weight in half of all these, besides the Fat Mine, which it actually doesn't work for. That's the only placed or thrown explosive that it doesn't work for, besides the gas bomb, I think. Splash damage can be useful for hitting multiple enemies. Mad Bomber is useful because you actually need that for the Nuka Grenade or the Fat Mine. It is also useful for other explosives. That one's just a good one to have. Demo Expert to get more damage. Hit the deck to not blow yourself up. Those are all really good perks to have with this. For an overall rating for the flashbang, I'm going to put this thing into F tier. I think it's one of the worst weapons in the game. However, it does at least have a niche against the tunnelers, which is kind of cool, and it is a very fun weapon to use. It is funny to throw this into a crowd and knock the whole crowd out. I do like that, even though it's not super practical for any reason, and it does aggro enemies too, which is kind of funny. I wish fatigue worked a little bit better in this game, but the flashbang actually does it pretty well, since the other fatigue options are usually based off of your actual damage. I think the flashbang just gives you a flat amount of fatigue. I could be wrong about that. Maybe explosive skills actually do increase the fatigue for this. But either way, that's kind of cool. Let's move on to our second explosive, which is going to be another thrown explosive. This is the Nuka Grenade. And the Nuka Grenade is substantially better than the flashbang and one of the best thrown explosives in the game. So the Nuka Grenade can be crafted on workbenches. You do need to have the Mad Bomber perk in order to make these, and these ones require 1 Abraxo Cleaner, 1 Nuka-Cola Quartz, 1 tin can, can't be bent, it has to be a regular tin can, and turpentine in order to make. Those aren't super hard things to find, and the Nuka Grenade can be a pretty good option if you want to make these, because they do quite a bit of damage. Nuka Grenade requires 100 explosives and 2 strength in order to wield, so a lot of explosives, but very little strength like most of the thrown explosives. This one does 1 damage on direct impact, 350 damage on the explosion, and then it deals fire damage over time. This is 2 damage for 5 seconds. That's pretty good. That actually makes it so you can clear up rooms of enemies and clear up even smaller enemies on the outskirts of the explosion a little bit easier just from the fire, so that's pretty nice. Aside from that, it just looks really cool too. This one has 229 damage per second, at least that's what it says on the wiki, so I'm just gonna say that. Depends on how many enemies you hit with all the explosives. This one has a big old 0 for crit damage, 1 times crit modifier, which doesn't matter when you can't hit crits, 24 action point cost, which is still the same as most of the thrown explosives, so that's perfectly fine. Thrown explosives are kind of iffy to be using in VATS, the flashbangs being the exception to that, because who cares if the flashbang goes off right next to you. And then these weigh half a weight, so they're not too heavy either. You will probably want to have a couple of these, but you don't necessarily need a whole ton of them to make use of them, like the flashbangs, where you're going to need a lot of them just to stun enemies. The Nuka Grenade, one of them will probably kill most enemies, so that's pretty nice. This one is one of the best thrown explosives in the game, and I would say this one's probably like an S tier explosive. So long as you can keep making these, which there is an infinite amount of stuff to keep making these, so you should be able to. The only, I guess, difficult part of making these would be finding enough Nuka-Cola quartz, because it's not always the most common thing, but you can check vendors and they might be selling it too. In which case you can get a pretty decent explosive. Let's move on to the placed explosives now, where we have the Satchel Charge as our first one. Satchel Charge is also in the Lonesome Road. These things are really hard to see in the Lonesome Road, and they do a lot of damage. They're also really good to be made because you can make these super early on, which is awesome. So these ones require 50 explosives and 2 strength to wield. Very low strength, average explosives. This one does 1 damage on direct impact, but you shouldn't be direct impacting stuff with the placed explosives. This one does 250 explosion damage, which is quite high for a placed explosive. Having 126 damage per second, at least that's what the wiki says. 0 crit damage, 1 times crit modifier. Cost 35 action points. Don't be using placed explosives in VATS. That's just not a good idea most of the time. And these ones actually weigh more than some of the other placed explosives at 0.75 of a weight. So they weigh 3/4 of a weight, as opposed to half a weight like most do, meaning that Pack Rat can help out with these more so than other explosives. The cool thing about Satchel Charges, though, is that you can make them at a very low level with explosives, which is awesome, and they take very common stuff, too. So you need 25 lead for this, which is easy to get. To say the least, it's really easy to get lead in this game. 25 pistol powder, which that one might be a little bit more difficult, but if you're not using pistols, then you can always break down the ammo from there, and you'll just get it right from that. 1 scrap electronic and 1 sensor module. All of those things can be found pretty easily. Vendors tend to sell a lot of them, so you can make Satchel Charges like right out the gate. If you're even in good springs, you should be able to make them with a reasonably okay explosive skill, making it so you actually have a really strong placed explosive. This one is just all around stronger than something like a frag mine, which is kind of like my go-to standard placed explosive. They're usually pretty nice to have. Same thing goes with like the frag grenades. The Satchel Charge is just better than that. It's better in just basically every way, aside from just weighing a little bit more. So the Satchel Charge, I would also put all the way up in S tier. I think it's one of the best placed explosives in the game. So Satchel Charges are pretty awesome. Now let's move on to the Fat Mine, which this is the biggest, baddest placed explosive in the game, at least in some terms. I would still say like the MFC clusters are way better than these in just about every way, because they're less dangerous to you. You can throw them way further. They do usually better damage, and they're not nearly as dangerous to you as the Fat Mine is. So the Fat Mine is quite literally a mini nuke that has had an explosive placed to it, and now you toss them out like mines. The Fat Man can already be super dangerous to yourself. The Fat Mine is even more dangerous to yourself, in my opinion. So this one requires 50 explosives and 3 strength in order to wield. More strength than other placed explosives, kind of makes sense with how heavy this thing is. This one does 5 damage on direct hit, but if you direct hit something, you're just gonna die. I'm pretty sure you're going to die right away from that. This one does 450 explosion damage, so very high explosion damage. This has 148 damage per second, at least that's what the wiki says. 0 for crit damage, 1 times crit modifier, cost 35 action points. Again, don't use this in VATS, never use the placed explosives in VATS, besides maybe the MFC clusters, which are more of a thrown weapon. And this one weighs 3 1/4 weight. It is very, very heavy. You can't carry around very many of these, which makes sense. This is actually a little bit heavier than the mini nuke, adding an extra 1/4 weight to them. So this one is unaffected by Pack Rat, meaning that it's always going to be the 3 1/4 weight. So you probably don't want to be carrying around very many of these. You're also going to have fairly high explosives and the Mad Bomber perk in order to make these. These ones do require 1 mini nuke, 1 sensor module, 1 scrap electronic, and 1 scrap metal. So none of that stuff is very difficult to get, besides I guess mini nukes, but even then it's not super difficult to buy mini nukes in New Vegas. The fat mine is very impractical for most jobs. The best way that I've found to use it is just toss a couple of them down towards stronger enemies, move a ways back, and then try to shoot that enemy and bait them into the explosion while you're far enough away. And that's going to be probably the safest way in order to use these. It's still not that practical. I would still rather have the Fat Man and just shoot mini nukes at the enemy, which is still rather dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as using the Fat Mine. So I don't think that this one's a great explosive. However, it can be an extremely devastating explosive. So in terms of practical use, this one's probably like F tier. In terms of damage, this one's probably S tier. So I'm going to split the difference and I'm going to put this one into C tier because it's just not practical a lot of the time. But if you can set up a situation to where it can be useful, like you're out in the open and you want to blow up a Deathclaw, the Fat Mine actually isn't a bad option to be doing that with. So C tier seems fine because it does have some value, just not as much as I would like. And that'll do it for all of the placed and thrown explosives. Tell me your thoughts on each of these. I know this was kind of a mishmash of different weapons, but some of these are pretty cool, like the Nuka Grenade and the Satchel Charge are really good in my opinion. Flashbang is kind of fun, but not really that good, and Fat Mine can be fun, but is very dangerous to yourself. So I don't really use it that much, if ever. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.